Bosch, the absolute titan of the global automotive supply chain, just bled €400 million in a single year. It is their first net financial loss in 17 years. The fallout? Over 13,000 jobs on the chopping block by 2030, specifically targeted at their automotive division. The German industrial engine is quite literally stalling out. We are witnessing the real-time execution of a $1.9 trillion industry. This is not a temporary market correction. This is an economic extinction event known as the Buggy whip effect. For those unfamiliar with economic theory, the Buggy whip effect describes a scenario where an entire, highly optimized supply chain dies overnight. It does not happen because the companies start making bad products. It happens because the technology their products support is abruptly erased from the societal equation. The men who braided leather for horse-drawn buggy whips at the turn of the 20th century were absolute masters of their craft. They were highly skilled, efficient, and profitable. But when Henry Ford rolled the Model T onto the dirt roads of America, the horse was removed from the transportation matrix. The buggy whip makers did not go bankrupt because they forgot how to braid leather. They went bankrupt because the horse left the road. Today, the internal combustion engine is the horse. And the massive ecosystem of Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 automotive parts suppliers, the companies that forge the pistons, cast the engine blocks, assemble the fuel pumps, and weld the catalytic converters, are the buggy whip makers. They are staring down the barrel of a zero-demand future, and the bankruptcy filings of 2025 and 2026 prove that the collapse is happening faster than anyone predicted. To understand the sheer scale of the bloodbath, we have to look at the cold, hard mathematics of engineering obsolescence. It is a simple game of subtraction, and the numbers are terrifying for traditional manufacturing. An internal combustion engine vehicle is a mechanical marvel, born from over a century of refinement. Its drivetrain, the system that generates power and delivers it to the wheels, contains approximately 2,000 moving parts. 2,000 individual components that must be designed, sourced, manufactured, shipped, assembled, and maintained. This includes spark plugs to ignite the fuel, fuel injectors to deliver it, multi-speed automatic transmissions with hundreds of interlocking planetary gears, clutches, and hydraulic valves, radiators, water pumps, and thermostats to keep the explosions from melting the block, alternators, starter motors, timing belts, serpentine belts, exhaust manifolds, mufflers, oxygen sensors, and catalytic converters loaded with precious metals. Every single one of these 2,000 moving parts represents a multi-million-dollar sub-industry. Every single one represents a factory, a workforce, a logistics chain, and a profit margin. Now look at the architecture of a modern electric vehicle. The EV drivetrain contains roughly 20 moving parts. 20. We are moving from 2,000 moving parts to 20. This is a 99% reduction in mechanical complexity. The electric motor itself essentially has one moving part, the rotor. There are reduction gears, half shafts, and wheel bearings. That is practically the entirety of the mechanical propulsion system. There are no spark plugs. There is no oil to change, which eliminates the need for oil filters, drain plugs, and oil pumps. There is no exhaust system, meaning the multi-billion-dollar muffler and catalytic converter industries are completely obsolete. There is no multi-speed transmission, wiping out the need for transmission fluid, complex valve bodies, and torque converters. The EV does not just replace the gas tank with a battery. It aggressively amputates thousands of legacy components from the vehicle's anatomy. For the consumer, fewer moving parts translate to less wear, less tear, and significantly lower maintenance costs. But for the global network of automotive parts makers, this simplicity is a death sentence. Consider the ripple effect of this subtraction. A traditional supplier, who specializes exclusively in high-performance exhaust manifolds or precision-machined fuel injectors, cannot simply retool their factory overnight to build high-voltage lithium-ion battery management systems. The core competencies are entirely different. One requires heavy metallurgy, casting, and fluid dynamics. The other requires advanced electrochemistry, semiconductor integration, and software engineering. You cannot teach a foundry to write code. The suppliers caught in the middle of this technological chasm are experiencing what industry analysts are calling the dual investment death trap. To survive the current decade, legacy parts makers are being forced into a brutal financial balancing act. They must continue to operate their traditional internal combustion engine manufacturing lines, because those components are what actually generate their current revenue. They need the cash flow from the dying technology to stay afloat. But simultaneously, they are forced to pour billions of dollars of capital expenditure into researching, developing, and building manufacturing lines for electric vehicle components. They are funding the slow wind down of their legacy business while mortgaging their future on a transition that is proving to be incredibly chaotic. The death trap snaps shut when the market timing misses. And in 2025 and 2026, the market timing missed drastically. The global transition to electric vehicles, particularly in Europe and North America, experienced a severe stalling effect. Forecasting agencies had to rapidly revise their EV market share projections downward. Consumer demand cooled due to high interest rates, persistent range anxiety, and a lagging public charging infrastructure. The traditional suppliers had already spent the money. They built massive, expensive, state-of-the-art production lines for electric vehicle components based on aggressive volume projections from automakers. But when the automakers dialed back their EV production targets due to the sluggish consumer adoption, the suppliers were left holding the bag. They now have underutilized, multi-million-dollar EV manufacturing lines burning through cash, alongside legacy ICE lines that are steadily declining in volume. The revenue is shrinking from both ends, while the capital expenditures have already been spent. This is exactly how you bankrupt a century-old industrial giant. The carnage is most visible in Europe, the historic heartland of precision automotive engineering. The data coming out of Germany in the first half of 2025 painted a devastating picture. According to restructuring firm Falkensteg, major insolvencies, meaning companies with revenues exceeding 10 million euros, hit a new peak, showing a 21% increase from the previous year's already elevated figures. The most alarming metric? Merely 1 in 6 of those insolvencies involved an automotive supplier. That is a staggering 65% rise compared to 2024. This is an industry experiencing a perfect storm of high costs, slow growth, and immense competitive pressure. When Bosch, a company that generated over 90 billion euros in revenue, announces that they have to cut 2.5 billion euros in annual costs just to stay competitive, it sends a shockwave through the entire Tier 2 and Tier 3 ecosystem. If the apex predator of the supply chain is bleeding out, the smaller players are already dead in the water. And it is not just the legacy parts makers who are collapsing. The electric transition itself is creating a massive startup graveyard, dragging suppliers down with it. Look at the spectacular failure of Northvolt. Once hailed as the torchbearer for the European Union's electric vehicle battery independence, Northvolt was supposed to be the domestic answer to Asian battery dominance. They raised billions in capital. They built massive gigafactories. But scaling up advanced electrochemical manufacturing is infinitely harder than drafting a business plan. Plagued by production delays, quality control failures, and an inability to hit volume targets, Northvolt's bankruptcy announcement in March 2025 sent a shockwave through the European continent. When an anchor company like Northvolt goes under, or when ambitious EV startups like Fisker or Lordstown file for Chapter 11, the collateral damage is immense. They default on their contracts with the suppliers. The Tier 2 and Tier 3 companies who took on massive debt to build customized parts. For these startups are suddenly left with unpaid invoices, useless inventory, and specialized machinery that cannot be repurposed. The startup graveyard is highly contagious. This exposes the inherent fragility of the just-in-time automotive supply chain. The relationship between automakers and their parts suppliers is deeply symbiotic, but the balance of power is entirely skewed. Automakers aggressively squeeze their suppliers for annual price reductions, demanding tighter margins year after year. The suppliers comply because they need the volume. But when the volume vanishes, the razor-thin margins offer absolutely no safety net. Furthermore, the transition to EV is systematically stripping the most profitable components away from the traditional Western suppliers and handing them to a completely new set of geopolitical players. The battery pack is the single most expensive component of an electric vehicle, often accounting for 30 to 40% of the vehicle's total cost. The legacy Western suppliers who used to dominate the high-value engine and transmission contracts do not make battery cells. They have been completely boxed out of the most critical and lucrative piece of the new technological architecture. Instead, the immense wealth of the EV transition is flowing directly eastward. The geopolitical squeeze is suffocating legacy Western parts makers. Highly subsidized, aggressively. Scaling Asian tech giants have secured absolute dominance over the entire battery supply chain. From the mining and refinement of critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, and nickel, to the mass production of the battery cells themselves, companies like CATL and BYD operate with a level of vertical integration and cost efficiency that Western suppliers simply cannot match. The European and American suppliers are caught in a vice. On one side, they are burdened by high domestic energy costs, stringent labor regulations, and the massive financial anchor of their dying ICE operations. On the other side, they are facing an onslaught from Chinese original equipment manufacturers who are excelling in innovation, heavily undercutting them on price, and operating with lead times that are fractions of the Western average. Chinese OEMs can bring a new vehicle from concept to production in as little as 6 months, whereas traditional Western automakers often require 2 to 3 years. The legacy supply chain cannot move fast enough to keep up with the new speed of the industry. This speed disparity is fatal. The modern automotive supply chain is being reshaped by software, silicon, and electrochemistry, completely abandoning the heavy metal, gears, and combustion principles that defined the 20th century. Traditional parts makers who assumed they could slowly coast into the AV transition on their own timeline are finding out the hard way that technology does not negotiate. The sheer volume of job losses already announced is staggering, but it is only the leading edge of the storm. Industry associations in Europe have explicitly warned that the shift to electric vehicles puts upwards of 500,000 traditional manufacturing jobs at immediate risk across the continent. And the harsh reality that politicians refuse to acknowledge is that the new jobs being created in the EV sector will not replace the ones being lost. Building an electric motor and writing battery management software requires fewer, highly specialized workers, completely bypassing the massive blue-collar workforce that once staffed the transmission and engine block foundries. This is a net negative job transition for the manufacturing class. The companies that are surviving and even thriving in this brutal new landscape are the ones that recognized the buggy whip effect early and pivoted aggressively. The survivors are not the ones trying to optimize exhaust manifolds. The survivors are the suppliers who completely transformed their identity. They moved out of mechanical components and heavily into niche technology sectors. They are the companies dominating the supply of advanced driver assistance systems, LiDAR sensors for autonomous driving, high-efficiency thermal management systems for battery packs, and vehicle-to-everything communication software. They understood that the vehicle of the future is not a mechanical machine that happens to have some electronics attached to it. The vehicle of the future is a high-performance computer on wheels. If your company is still focused on forging metal to contain small explosions, you are no longer in the automotive industry. You are in the heritage preservation business. Consider the fundamental shift in revenue models. For a century, auto parts makers made their money on physical volume and replacement parts. Things broke, things wore out, and the suppliers sold the replacements. Water pumps failed. Timing belts snapped. Brake pads deteriorated rapidly. But regenerative braking in electric vehicles means the physical brake pads rarely need replacing. The lack of engine heat and vibration means cooling systems and hoses last exponentially longer. The entire aftermarket ecosystem, a massive profit center for legacy suppliers, is being decimated by the sheer reliability of the electric drivetrain. The value in the modern vehicle is no longer physical, it is digital. Automakers are shifting towards software-defined vehicles, where upgrades and new features are delivered over the air, entirely bypassing the physical supply chain. When a car's performance is improved by a code update rather than a new mechanical component, the traditional parts supplier is rendered completely irrelevant. They cannot sell an over-the-air update if their only product is a stamped piece of steel. This transition is no longer a forecast. It is no longer a distant projection mapped out in a boardroom presentation. It is an active, ruthless elimination round happening right now on the factory floors of Germany, the industrial heartlands of America, and the technological hubs of Asia. The bankruptcies of 2025 and the massive restructuring announcements of 2026 are the death knells of the internal combustion era. The traditional automotive supply chain is a towering structure built on a foundation that is actively crumbling. The automakers themselves will likely survive the transition, leveraging their brand equity and massive capital reserves to pivot. But the thousands of anonymous suppliers operating in their shadow do not have that luxury. They are trapped by their own legacy, weighed down by immense overhead, and rapidly losing relevance in a world that no longer requires their specific set of skills. The buggy whip effect is absolute. It does not care about the heritage of a brand, the craftsmanship of a product, or the number of workers employed in a factory. It is driven by the cold, unforgiving logic of technological progress. The internal combustion engine had an incredible run. It built the modern world, shaped our cities, and fueled a century of unparalleled economic growth. But its time has passed. The parts makers who refuse to let go of the tailpipe are going down with the ship. They are fighting a war against gravity, trying to optimize a machine that the market has already decided to abandon. The transition to the electric future will not be smooth. It will be chaotic, destructive, and incredibly painful for the legacy industrial sector. Entire towns built around single factories will face economic devastation. The geopolitical balance of manufacturing power has already shifted permanently. This is the harsh reality of the industrial disruptor cycle. We are witnessing the final days of the mechanical age, and the birth of a terrifyingly efficient, software-defined future. The bankruptcies will continue. The job cuts will accelerate. The supply chain blackouts will reshape the global economy. Because at the end of the day, no matter how perfectly you braid the leather, nobody is buying a buggy whip when the horse is already dead.